So we come to our keynote speaker, which will be David Hirshleifer. He's Professor of Finance and Mirage Chair in Business Growth at University of California, Irvine. He's expert in the fields corporate finance, investments, and economics. And his recent research topics are psychology in firms and markets. And as you all know, he published extensively in top finance and economics journals. And he received numerous awards, including the Smith-Breeden Award for an outstanding paper in the Journal of Finance. He has served as editor of the Review of Financial Studies, as associate editor of the Journal of Finance, and as co-editor or associate editor of several other journals in finance, economics, and corporate strategy. He was also director of the American Finance Association, as well as the Western Finance Association. Before joining UC Irvine, he was working at Ohio State University, University of Michigan, and as a tenured faculty member at UCLA. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome with me Professor David Hirshleifer.
Well, I want to thank very much Manfred and Stefan for organizing this very impressive conference. And this is a further step forward for an organization that's been moving forward by leaps and bounds, thanks to the remarkable efforts of its founder, John Dukas. So the EFMA has been making incredible strides, so it's really my great honor to be able to address you today. At a delightful dinner not long ago, a former president of the American Finance Association said to me that as a behavioral financial economist, I really should be a great proponent of regulation to protect investors from themselves. He was quite surprised by my reaction that the behavioral approach in some ways strengthens the case for laissez-faire and raises some new suspicions about regulation because much regulation is driven by psychological bias on the part of the regulators, not the regulated. As my colleagues Kent Daniel, Siapong Teo, and I emphasized in a 2002 paper, individuals have stronger incentives to study carefully and overcome their biases when investing their own money than when voting about matters that affect other people's money. We also argued there that the modern case for laissez-faire, based upon optimality of competitive equilibrium and informational efficiency of capital markets, was unduly brittle, in the sense that any imperfection in the market provides a case for regulation. In contrast, a behavioral approach suggests that even though markets work imperfectly, the political process works even worse. My main topic today is not normative, though I return to policy issues at will, and especially at the end of this talk. My main purpose, however, is to propose a new positive approach to financial regulation. The behavioral revolution in finance has mainly taken regulatory structures as given. And the applications to regulation have been mainly along normative lines, as suggested by my dinner companion, figuring out how to protect naive investors. Meanwhile, positive research on financial regulation has focused on the interaction of rational selfish interest groups. A great missing chapter in the theory of financial regulation is the study of how irrationality by participants in the political process affects regulatory outcomes. Such an analysis recognizes that regulators, politicians, and voters are subject to systematic biases. I call this approach the psychological attraction approach to regulation because certain beliefs about regulation are especially good at exploiting people's psychological biases to attract attention and support. If psychological bias affects behavior in capital markets, a fortiori it should affect political behavior. A small step toward a psychological approach is the notion that rational ignorance causes individuals to vote foolishly or not at all. However, rational ignorance alone does not explain systematic bias. It cannot explain why voters would make the same mistake decade after decade, as with approving protectionism and farm subsidies, nor why some forms of proposed regulation are more tempting than others. In a rational setting, the rhetoric of political discourse does not matter. I'll argue instead that the form of political discourse is crucial. Economists have long wondered why harmful policies are so enticing. Inattention alone is not the answer. Often, bad policies are adopted at exactly the time when public attention is focused on them. To understand the form of regulation, we need to understand what kinds of information are the most salient and what kinds of arguments and plans are the most alluring. We also need to understand the social process by which naive feelings and beliefs about public policy spread through the media and from person to person. I offer today an overview that even includes slides. An overview of some important psychological and social processes that underlie financial and other forms of regulation. On this list of social processes, the first five are mainly individual effects, and the last two move to social interactions more heavily as well. I'll consider these effects in sequence, and then I'll conclude by discussing policy implications. So the first is salience and vividness effects. The political battle is a struggle for public attention. Constraints on attention and cognitive processing power condition every aspect of public discourse, as exemplified by the power of simplistic sound bites. Political competitors craft catchy themes to be plausible, easily understood, and remembered. Attention, in general, is drawn to salient stimuli that contrast with other stimuli in the environment, and to vivid stimuli such as personal stories about individual experiences and emotionally arousing information. Regulatory debates are influenced heavily by extreme individual cases and emotional stories. For example, the Enron scandal helped set the stage for the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, or SOX, a major change in U.S. reporting regulations. An exceptionally vivid aspect of the disaster was the ruin of employees who had large fractions of their retirement invested in Enron stock. Management had led employees to believe that Enron stock was a great investment for retirement, even while selling their own shares. Enron provided simple dramatic narratives of good versus evil, pride coming before a fall, which the media imparted with relish. Protecting employees who invest in their own company's stock was not the primary explicit motivation for SOX, but together with other high-profile accounting frauds, the emotion-laden publicity in the Enron disaster helped set the stage with an anti-business public mood that created intense pressure for a regulatory response. The costs of disclosure imposed by SOX upon general shareholders are much less vivid than poignant stories about families ruined by lies and misconduct. Indeed, the costs of SOX to general shareholders can be integrated with the overall profits that firms generally make, so that general shareholders are still perceived as overall gainers. This integration effect applies to many regulations that quietly impose costs on all shareholders. More generally, the costs of regulation, though widely incurred, are often far less salient than the exceptional wrongdoings that incited the regulation. For example, management time and attention are intangible. Furthermore, people underweight the probabilities of event contingencies that are not explicitly available for consideration. So planners underestimate the costs of financial regulation and underweight the unexpected side effects of regulation. For SOX, several observers claim that the cost in managerial time and focus were much greater than was foreseen when the regulation was being planned. Media reporting of salient derivatives losses, such as those in the Barings fiasco, create an association in observers' minds of derivatives with losses. A failure to consider the concept of hedging, another aspect of limited attention, creates a perception that derivatives are always dangerous. Together, these attentional effects create pressures to regulate derivatives as well. The second topic I will tell you about is omission bias and associated norms. According to the psychologists Ilana Ritov and Jonathan Barron, omission bias is the tendency to favor omissions, such as letting someone die, over otherwise equivalent commissions, such as killing someone actively. For example, subjects recommend against vaccination of a child, even when the likelihood of death from vaccination is much less than the reduction in the likelihood of death from disease. Corporate hedging is much more likely, even than a vaccination, to cause adverse side effects, namely losses. Observers who are subject to omission bias will dislike hedging losses, since these could be avoided by not hedging. Observers, similarly, these observers, owing to omission bias, may perceive even a good hedge as being increasing rather than decreasing of risk. Similarly, omission bias can deter making purchases to diversify into seemingly risky assets or securities, such as the Vietnam stock market or real estate. Regulation by government or other institutions to protect unsophisticated investors from supposedly dangerous securities or asset classes therefore can block risk-reducing diversification. For example, Diane Del Guercio discusses how U.S. courts usually evaluate whether an asset is a prudent investment in isolation rather than as part of a portfolio. She documents that institutions that are subject to especially stringent prudent man standards tilt their portfolios away from supposedly low-quality stocks. Omission bias also helps explain rules of some pension plans preventing diversification into major asset classes, rules that limit trading of the stock of privately held firms, and rules that limit participation in hedge funds to qualified investors. The next topic I turn to is scapegoating and xenophobia. People tend to prefer members of their own groups over outsiders, a phenomenon called in-group bias. In its form is xenophobia, hostility towards strangers or foreigners. A further deep-rooted source of conflict is self-serving attribution bias. In interactions with others, we think that we are in the right and they are in the wrong. This bias extends to group-serving interpretations as well, in the extreme causing fanatical antagonism toward other groups. Xenophobia can help explain regulation of foreign shareholding and control of domestic companies. Cross-national takeovers are politically delicate, especially when heavily reported in the press. In part for patriotic reasons, many countries have government ownership of airlines or firms in other key industries. When things go wrong, people eagerly look for someone to blame. Blame is placed upon some visible, disliked, and relatively weak outgroup, a phenomenon known as scapegoating. Scapegoating encourages regulatory responses to prevent future misconduct. With regard to risks of plunging into own company stock, as in the Enron debacle, teaching or forcing investors to diversify out of own company stock is relevant. Financial disclosure requirements is not. However, placing the burden of change upon the victims of a disaster feels unjust. It is far more intuitive to constrain villains or potential villains. Market downturns increase pressure for regulation, as reflected in the Securities Acts in the US of 1933 and 1934, and the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation after the millennial tech boom, and the boom in collapse. The psychological approach offers a simple explanation: the urge to find someone to blame. Chance or personal incompetence are not satisfying as an explanation for our losses. Villainy as an explanation is more salient and more satisfying for our self-esteem. Regardless of whether misconduct had any important macro effect, villains will be found and will be perceived to be important. For the great millennial stock market boom, the possibility that such an event could be the spontaneous result of the interactions of different investors and other parties is not especially vivid. Explanations based on villainy are much more attractive. That regulators succumb to political pressures, that analysts and investment banks were lying, and so forth. Such explanations provide ready arguments in favor of regulation. Market downturns also trigger vilification of speculators. Hard economic times trigger vilification of lenders as well, increasing the pressure for usury legislation. The fourth category I'll tell you about is fairness and reciprocity norms. Inconsistent norms of behavior coexist within people's minds, supported by strong feelings. Three important norms of behavior are reciprocity, equality, and charity. Reciprocity, or fair exchange, requires no taking without giving. Equality requires equal division of resources, and charity requires trying to relieve distress, where distress is often measured in terms of recent losses rather than absolute wealth levels. These norms have a basis in evolved human psychology, but are also culturally spread and enforced. The equal division norm is reflected, for example, in progressive income taxes, in experiments with resource transfer gains, the tendency of individuals to share equally. Feelings of envy help motivate action to limit the power and wealth of important individuals. Feelings of envy and the salience of the equality norm are intensified when the group is doing poorly. So think of wealthy executives engaging in layoffs. Such attitudes explain regulation of managerial compensation. For example, in the US, corporate taxes on executive salaries greater than $1 million, and recent proposals to require an annual shareholder advisory vote for executive compensation plans. The norm of reciprocity supports mutually beneficial exchange. It therefore requires the punishment of violators, even if doing so is costly. People who are wronged feel anger and an urge for revenge. A readiness to succumb to uncontrollable rage has strategic value as a commitment. We don't step on the toes of someone who is prone to irrational rages. Insults or damage to a group that an individual deeply identifies with also provoke anger. The thirst for vengeance against perceived wrongdoers can go too far, imposing heavy social costs. For example, in the US, anger by juries against corporate misconduct motivates unpredictable jackpot litigation awards, which deter exchange and innovation. The scapegoating of speculators and lenders derives in part from reciprocity norms. The idea that intermediation adds value is unintuitive. Cognitive resources are needed to recognize that shifting resources across locations or over time creates a different product. Intermediating merchants are therefore often viewed as parasites, and their price margins as proof of cheating. Traveling merchants have often been vilified as price gougers. The medieval concept of the just price held that it is equal to the cost of the seller, leaving no room for profit. Furthermore, buyers do not see all the costs incurred by middlemen. Low availability of cost to buyers leads to the inference of price gouging. Often through history, the drive to eliminate the middleman has been violent, going at least as far back as the biblical account of Jesus ejecting foreign exchange dealers from the temple. English common and statute law, starting in the Middle Ages, made commodity speculation a crime with severe punishment for violators. The norm of equality creates hostility toward lenders, since it is the rich who have the funds to finance the poor. The charity norm suggests that high product prices and interest rates are objectionable when the client is poor or recently distressed. The norm of reciprocity is a crucial element in the case against usury. A zero interest rate seems fair because people neglect the fact that the same amount of money is worth something different at one date than another date. This confusion influenced medieval Christian views on usury. The social benefits to speculative activity are especially subtle and abstract. Popular discussions neglect the benefit of making asset prices more efficient, which improves resource allocation. Speculators are instead viewed as profiting at the expense of others, as part of a zero-sum game. The apparent costs to society of speculation are much more salient. The correlation of speculative profits from commodities with high prices to consumers encourages an inference that speculation increases prices. Adam Smith compared the fear of speculators to the fear of witches. Security speculators are especially active in volatile times. The association of speculative activity with volatility and with crashes leads to a confusion between correlation and causation, especially for short sellers who help prices adjust downward. It's tempting to kill the bearers of ill tidings when the bearer is getting rich from those tidings. Regulations in many countries are designed to limit speculation, such as higher taxes, higher taxation of short-term capital gains, security transactions taxes, and restrictions or bans on short selling. Biased attitudes toward speculation also tarnish perceptions of derivatives, which are viewed as instruments of financial wheeling and dealing. This makes derivatives an attractive target for regulation. I now turn to the psychological effect of overconfidence. We're experienced with the problems of personal everyday life and know how to attack them. A natural mistake is to extend this can-do attitude to the societal level. It is, however, far harder to make good decisions on behalf of millions of interacting individuals, each with their own preferences and their own information. As emphasized by Adam Smith and Friedrich Hayek, there is a spontaneous order, a web of co-adaptations brought about by individual decisions, which is impossible for a planner to understand in full detail. Indeed, the entire concept of a spontaneous order in markets was not developed until the 18th century. Markets represent the accumulation of creative solutions to problems, some carefully designed, others, as with biologically evolved adaptations, the happy outcome of trial and error. The human mind evolved to understand social action in terms of individual causes and effects. It was not designed to intuitively grasp the economy as a complex, functionally adapted system. The failure of socialism confirms that it is hard to manage an economy from the top down. Value-increasing interventions are scarcer at the societal level than at the individual level, because it is only at the societal level that market failure is a prerequisite for the intervention to be valuable. A lack of understanding of the idea of this spontaneous order, combined with general attentional constraints, makes regulatory solutions to perceived problems unduly appealing. The public wants government to do something about problems, which implicitly assumes that a useful intervention exists. Also, the fact that a commentator proposes a solution to a problem suggests that is a signal that the proposer thinks the solution has value. The public does not pay close attention to the details of proposals and therefore infers that possible improvements can be made. Overconfidence is the belief that one's personal qualities are better than they really are. Overconfidence helps explain excessive activism in regulatory strategies, just as it has been found to explain excessive activism in trading strategies by individual investors. Overconfident policy analysts too readily assume that a perceived social problem has not yet been addressed by the market, and are too sure of proposed remedies. If the average potential remedy will make things worse, overconfidence leads to the adoption of too many remedies. Even economists who surely understand the general notion of a spontaneous order do not always internalize fully, in specific regulatory contexts, the richness of adaptation of the economic system. A possible illustration is the proposal of transactions taxes in asset markets to reduce speculation. Transactions taxes for this purpose are prevalent internationally and have been proposed repeatedly in the United States, both in broad-based and targeted forms. Proponents include leading economists such as Keynes, Tobin, and after the 1987 stock market crash, Lawrence Summers and Joseph Stiglitz. Just as a tariff is like a negative railroad, a transactions tax on stock trading is a destroyer of liquidity. At first glance, a bad thing. I focus on arguments for transactions taxes based upon the claim that excessive speculation leads to overreactions, to excess volatility, and to resource misallocation. My purpose is not to weigh the pros and cons of transactions taxes overall, but just to illustrate how even sophisticated policymakers can neglect market adaptations. Proponents of security transactions taxes have not, to my knowledge, discussed how markets might be able to do something about excessive trading. Exchanges influence the liquidity of securities through a variety of means, such as designating a market maker with an affirmative obligation to maintain liquidity in the market. Firms make choices about their liquidity too. Many firms never go public at all, and many firms have gone private, creating their own individual securities transaction taxes. Some public firms, such as Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, don't split their stocks, thereby increasing the stock price and making the firm illiquid. Firms choose which exchange to list on. In some exchanges, there is independent negotiation between listed firms and agents about how to create liquidity for their stocks. Firms can also reduce liquidity through non-disclosure, which increases adverse selection problems. So, if excessive trading creates externalities, there are many avenues for markets to internalize them. I'm not saying that transactions taxes are good or bad. What these points illustrate is that academics seem to have neglected the possibility that some of the potential costs of irrational speculative trading could be internalized by the market. Suppressing the opinions of speculators by taxing stock trading is analogous in an intellectual setting to suppressing ideas by taxing speech. Irrational investors overreact in their trades. Internet bloggers and college professors also disseminate immoderate opinions. Taxing the internet or universities might shift discourse in more reasonable directions. For some reason, people are more sympathetic to suppressing opinions that are expressed through trading than through speech. It's hard to see why financial speculation would be more dangerous than intellectual speculation. We also expect officials and media kibitzers to be overconfident about their ability to helpfully manage market fluctuations. Many think that they can identify useful strategies for managing interest rates, or to cool overheated stock markets, or to lift the economy out of recession. The illusion of control, an aspect of overconfidence, tempts observers to think that bubbles and crashes can be averted by intelligent policy. This leads commentators to blame any regulatory system that fails to avert adverse outcomes. As a result, bad news incites calls for new regulation. Another example of high policy analyst confidence in a negative railroad kind of solution is a recommendation made by the Commission on the Regulation of U.S. Capital Markets in the 20th century. Managers hate to miss earnings forecasts, which usually result in a big drop in stock price. The Commission recommends that public companies stop issuing earnings forecasts, known as guidance, or at most give annual instead of quarterly guidance, and a range forecast instead of a single number. In other words, firms should make corporate disclosure limited, infrequent, and noisy. There are indeed agency problems and inefficiencies associated with earnings forecasts. However, before leaping to a policy recommendation, we need to understand why the market has not already adopted it. Firms are already free to refrain from making forecasts, for example. The sharp market reaction to missed earnings forecasts suggests that investors view quarterly earnings forecasts as highly informative about the firm's long-run prospects. This is what creates incentives to manipulate earnings to meet forecasts. Manipulation may add noise, but scrapping the signal entirely creates infinite noise. In fact, the argument that investors focus too much on quarterly earnings forecasts or other information seems to have no empirical support. Earnings surprises are positive predictors of long-run future returns, which suggests that the market underreacts to quarterly earnings information. We now turn to the sixth topic, which brings us into social interactions. Short-term moods affect even long-term judgments, as well as market behavior. Heuristic decision-making based on gut feelings causes big errors. And since mood is contagious, such mistakes can aggregate to the societal level. Since negative mood is associated with greater pessimism and greater critical thinking, after bad news, we expect a push toward greater regulation to protect against perceived misconduct and threats. Hazards tend to gain widespread public attention in intense bursts. In the availability heuristic, individuals judge the frequency or importance of a phenomenon according to their ability to remember examples of it. As a result, as emphasized by Timur Puran and Cass Sunstein, the more that people talk about a risk or problem, the more important they think it is, leading to a self-reinforcing cycle that they call availability cascades. The news media amplify the availability of threats selectively. For example, horrifying risks like shark attacks seem more common than they really are because they are newsworthy. In an availability cascade, as the news media or general public opinion swings toward one position, the presentation of evidence becomes increasingly one-sided. People do not discount adequately for one-sided evidence. And as a result, during an availability cascade that is focused on some perceived threat, the political pressure toward regulation can become unstoppable. For example, owing to vivid major scandals after the turn of the third millennium, corporate fraud and angry moral judgments became highly available, creating enormous political pressure for action by the U.S. Congress. During bad times, when firms become distressed and manipulation activities come to light, public attention focuses more on misconduct. As a result, there is pressure for tightening financial controls, and there is greater litigation against alleged wrongdoers. The benefit to availability entrepreneurs, such as public prosecutors, of taking action against perceived misconduct, possibly gray area activities, increases. As even more wrongdoers are sued or imprisoned, news about misconduct becomes even more available in the media. Thus, increasing restrictiveness of the regulatory environment is self-reinforcing. The seventh and last of the list of processes is ideological replicators. Why is there so much economic and financial regulation, and why is it so often dysfunctional? For example, socialism once held sway disastrously over much of the planet. Yet anti-market ideology remains popular and is a wellspring of economic and financial regulation. To explain these phenomena, I now consider how ideologies shape financial regulation. Ideologies exist because they are good at catching our cognitive and emotional hooks, which helps them to spread from person to person. In the terminology of the zoologist Richard Dawkins, ideologies are cultural replicators, or memes. In particular, ideologies are assemblies of more basic memes, very simple propositions or ideas that affect our thinking. Religious ideology directly affects financial regulation, as with prohibitions on usury and attitudes toward inequality. Utopian ideologies like communism apply the equality norm to reject private property and exchange. Ideologies of class conflict incite envy, envy of the rich, and the idea that business activity is evil. One of the world's great charitable institutions, Hollywood, incessantly depicts businessmen as thieves and murderers. Since ancient times, intellectuals and the old rich had a disdain for trade. Critics of trade include Aristotle, Confucius, and Thomas Aquinas, for example. The meme that commerce is a zero-sum game reinforces the socialist meme assembly. Survey evidence shows such beliefs to be common. Zero-sum views of trade are more appealing in a stagnating economy in which people crave explanations and scapegoats for their hardships. Utopian mass movements therefore thrive during times of change and dislocation, when individuals who have damaged self-regard seek a cause outside themselves. The psychological attraction approach therefore predicts a shift toward socialism in hard times and a shift toward liberalism during times of growth and innovation. To see in a more specific application how a financial ideology promotes its own replication, consider the allegation that markets and firms are too focused on the short term. During the 1980s, popular discussion of the U.S. economy criticized takeovers, underinvestment, and lack of innovation. Japan was cited with fear and envy for its putatively superior corporate model of long-term focus. I argue that psychological bias made such criticisms attractive, and that this led to the evolution of an ideology which I call anti-short-termism. Ideologies evolve by adding virulent and complementary means and discarding the feeble or incompatible ones. It is much more important for memes or propositions to be superficially plausible and emotionally strong and compatible than for them to be logical. For example, critics of short-termism routinely conflate 5 distinct propositions: that firms are focused on short-term stock prices, that firms underinvest, that firms do not innovate, that firms are over-leveraged, and that the stock market is too short-term focused, an informational inefficiency. Actually, since the stock market on average reacts positively to increases in capital expenditures, the attempt of firms to boost short-term stock prices should promote overinvestment. And theoretical modeling shows can even promote innovation as well. As for the proposition that the stock market is obsessed with the short term, empirically, the stock market seems to overvalue growth opportunities. Consider, for example, the value effect. Nor is there good evidence that the market overreacts to short-term earnings-related news, nor that firms are over-leveraged. Furthermore, the allegedly short-termist U.S. economy ended up out-innovating Japan during the 1990s. Nevertheless, the 5 concepts of short-termism complement each other emotionally to form a more virulent ideology. Labeling all the distinct criticisms short-termism recruits our pre-existing mental equipment for thinking about morality and sin, folly and wisdom, the ant and the grasshopper. The joining of these means makes the ideology far more contagious. Moralistic interpretation dominates public discussion of short-termism. In personal life, heavy borrowing is improvident. Popular discussion mistakenly extends this norm to firms. Moralistic interpretation also feels good. It provides a satisfying narrative in which sin and folly are followed by punishment. Criticizing the defects of others helps us feel good about ourselves and helps us gain status by signaling the purity of our own high moral standards. Also vital to the success of an ideology is wide applicability to many examples and contexts and imperviousness to refutation. The ideology of anti-short-termism has both of these features, since it is easy to attribute bad outcomes to short-termism and very hard to disprove. In summary, the ideology of anti-short-termism is popular not because it makes sense, nor even because it benefits anyone, but merely because it is good at being popular. Of broad importance as a source of ideologies that affect financial markets are conspiracy theories. Dangers that are potentially catastrophic, but whose workings are unseen or poorly understood, are disturbing, which is a motivation for finance and economic models based upon uncertainty aversion, or ambiguity aversion, or familiarity bias. A dread of hidden menace is a natural precursor to conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are assemblies of means which claim that some villainous group has the power and intent to do harm. They are reinforced by xenophobic instincts and by hard times and social disruption. During market crashes, conspiracy theories have included accusations that foreign enemies were engaged in bear raids on U.S. stock markets, for example. There are also persistent claims that an international cabal of Jewish bankers or speculators control the world financial system. Receptiveness to conspiracy theories about the financial system may derive from the fact that it is complicated and poorly understood by most people. Speculators such as hedge fund managers are suspect since they operate in secrecy and are often foreigners. The idea that a market crash reflects the interaction of many individuals, no single one of which is powerful, is unintuitive. Hyperactive agency detection, a general tendency for people to attribute observed actions to intentional agents, applies. Our psychology primes us to perceive market crashes as resulting from intentional manipulation by powerful individuals or groups. I'll conclude with a few words of summary and about policy implications of the psychological attraction approach. The main alternative to the psychological attraction theory of regulation, the rational self-interest approach, faces two puzzles which suggest that it also implicitly relies on psychological bias as well. First, most people would deny that self-interest is their primary political motivation. Indeed, individuals altruistically donate time, effort, and funds to their pressure groups. The second puzzle is how successful pressure groups manage to fool other voters systematically over long periods of time. To understand how competition between pressure groups really works, we need to consider explicitly how these groups enlist psychological biases on their sides. An implication of the psychological attraction approach to regulation is that regulatory responses to perceived problems will often be ineffective. Indeed, we expect often to see friendly fire incidents in which the regulations hurt the parties that they are intended to help. The rational pressure group theory does not capture such effects, since such an outcome involves fooling political participants about the true intent and consequences of regulation. The psychological attraction theory also implies that bad regulations can result even when all political participants have unselfish intentions. And since the universe of possible tempting regulations is unlimited, the theory predicts a general tendency for overregulation and for regulations to accrete over time like barnacles, impeding economic productivity. The theory also predicts occasional drastic increases in regulation in response to market downturns or disruption. My purpose today has been to offer a positive theory of regulation. In my remaining time, I will discuss policy implications. The psychological attraction approach implies that meta-policy matters. The building inertia into the political system constrains the effects of psychological bias on future policy decisions. This helps because irrational pressure for bad regulation is often transient, as with availability cascades. Systemic inertia can be achieved through constitutional limitations, such as separation of powers, irrevocable rights, and supermajority rules. Sunset provisions in legislation can also help. These notions are quite consistent with the liberal tradition in political philosophy. Ending a talk with a call for future research is an academic cliché. Nevertheless, I want to persuade you that it is vital to explore this uncharted continent, the study of how psychological bias and ideology affect regulation. Ideas really do matter. As political participants, we can't start correcting our errors until we start to recognize them. John Maynard Keynes famously said that madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. In the 18th century, the writings of Adam Smith clarified how the economy works and shifted public discourse and regulation toward laissez-faire. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Karl Marx and others built anti-market ideologies of extraordinary virulence, which had an even greater influence on the world. In the 21st century, an understanding of how psychology affects the political process can help immunize us against pernicious ideologies and increase the role of reason in political and regulatory decisions. Thank you.
So thank you, David, for this very interesting talk.
Thank you very much, Manfred.
I want to follow giving you a present from the organizers.
Oh, thank you so
very much.
much.
This present should remind you of Vienna and of the EFMA2007 conference.
Well, it seems heavier than the torts that I had in Vienna. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Now I want to ask John Lucas to hand over the traditional EFMA certificate.
Thank you so much. It's my honor. Thanks, John.
Colleagues, I would like to congratulate you for your participation at the 16th annual EFMA meeting, and I hope that you found the intellectual interaction of this conference stimulating and rewarding for your research and your professional goals. Before I proceed with my major duty tonight, which is to present the awards, the EFMA awards, I'd like to take a minute to thank our EFMA sponsors for their generous support, the Vienna University of Economics and Business Administration, the City of Vienna for their hospitality, and especially the mayor. EFMA is also thankful to the organizing committee, the program committee, session chairs, discussants, and special guests and speakers for their contributions to the quality of these meetings. This conference could not have been possible without the tremendous efforts of our program chairs, Stefan Bogner and Manfred Frederick. And they have done a terrific job, and I also like to congratulate their organizing committee, and especially Mrs. Hammer and Stefan Silly. Please join me to congratulate them with a very strong applause. In the tradition of the EFMA, I would like to present our co-chairs. Stand up, flag, and thank you very much.